The station called Cradle Halo hung in the dark like a lantern nobody had lit on purpose. It orbited a dead star, a cinder that had burned out long before any of the species now arguing inside the station had learned to count. Someone in the deep past had built the place as a meeting ground, a neutral ring of stone and steel where enemies could sit across a table without either side owning the ground beneath their feet. Its builders were gone. The idea of it remained, and that was the only reason the war between humanity and the Viharan had a room to end in. The war was 40 years old. It was older than most of the people fighting it, older than every soldier who had died in it, old enough that the reasons it had begun had worn as smooth as river stones and no longer fit anyone's hand. There had been an incident at the seam once, a human survey ship and a Viharan patrol and a misread signal, and both sides had fired, and both sides had been certain the other had fired first, and both sides had gone home and told the story in a way that made the other the aggressor. From that single ugly hour a war had grown the way a war grows, feeding on itself, each death a debt, each debt a reason for another death, until the original hour was forgotten and only the debt remained, passed down from parents to children like an heirloom no one had asked to inherit. Neither species could remember anymore what winning would even look like. They only knew what losing looked like, because they had both been doing it for 40 years, and they had grown so used to the shape of it that the idea of stopping frightened them almost as much as the idea of going on. The talks at Cradle Halo were the third attempt in a generation to end it. The first two had failed before anyone reached a table. This one had reached a table. That going in had felt like progress. Ela had let herself believe it was progress. She had been young enough still to believe that reaching the table was most of the journey, and old enough by the end of the third day to understand that reaching the table was nothing at all, that the table was where the real war was fought, with words instead of ships, and that a person could lose it just as completely and bury just as many. Ela Wren was 27 years old, and she had not slept properly in 9 days. She stood at the tall window of the observation gallery, watching the delegation shuttles rest in their cradles far below, and she told herself the tiredness was ordinary. Everyone at the talks was tired. The senior envoy was tired. The Viharan were tired, though it was hard to read tiredness on a face that did not move the way a human face moved. Tiredness was the natural weather of a peace negotiation, the way rain was the natural weather of certain worlds. You dressed for it and you kept walking. But this was not ordinary tiredness. This was the tiredness of someone who had watched a thing go wrong for 3 days and had not been allowed to reach out and stop it. The talks were dying. She had known it since the second session when the senior envoy, a broad and confident man named L. Corin who had negotiated 4 treaties in his long career, had leaned across the table and told the Viharan lead that their demands were, in his exact words, a fantasy for children. He had smiled when he said it. He believed the smile softened the words. Corin believed a great many things about the softening power of his own charm, and most of them had been true across 4 treaties with 4 species who happened to smile back. The Viharan did not smile back. They did not have the equipment for it, and more than that, they did not have the culture for it. Ela had spent 2 years of her short career learning everything the archives held about the Viharan, which was not much, because humanity and the Viharan had spent most of their shared history shooting at each other across a contested band of stars called the Seam. But she had learned enough to know one thing that Corin, in all his confidence, had never bothered to learn. The Viharan did not measure a person by what they said. They measured a person by what they did when saying cost them nothing, and doing cost them everything. To the Viharan, words were cheap. A being who spent many words was a being trying to buy something without paying. And Corin spent words the way a rich man spends coins in a poor town, scattering them, enjoying the noise they made, never noticing the faces of the people who caught them. Ila heard the door behind her before she heard the footsteps. She turned. Corin came in with 2 aides trailing him and a data slate held loosely in one hand, the way a man holds a thing he has already decided he does not need. He looked pleased. That frightened her more than if he had looked worried. "They'll fold by morning," he said before she could speak. "You watch." The speaker went quiet in the last hour. Quiet means they're counting the cost. When they count the cost, they see they can't win the seam and they fold. "The speaker went quiet," Ila said carefully, "because you told the delegation that their memorial rite was, and I am quoting you, a waste of everyone's afternoon." Corin waved the slate. "It was 90 minutes of standing in a circle humming at a bowl of water. We are ending a war, Ren. We do not have 90 minutes. It was the drowning rite." She kept her voice even, though something in her wanted to climb. "It's how they mourn the dead of a battle before they agree to stop fighting. They were mourning our dead too, both fleets. They named the human ships. They were trying to honor the people we lost at the seam, and you told them it was a waste of an afternoon." For the first time, a flicker of something crossed Corin's face. Not doubt. Corin did not do doubt. It was the irritation of a confident man being told a fact that did not fit his plan, the small twitch that says the fact will be discarded rather than examined. "They'll fold by morning," he said again, and that was the end of the conversation as far as he was concerned. They did not fold by morning. The final session was called for the 9th hour, station time. Ila sat 2 seats down from Corin, in the place reserved for the assistant envoy, which was a polite title for a young woman who was permitted to be in the room and not permitted to speak in it. Across the long dark table, carved by hands nobody remembered, the Viharan delegation filed in and took their places with the slow, deliberate grace of a people who did nothing quickly. There were 5 of them. Their leader was the speaker, whose true name was a chord of sounds no human throat could shape, so the humans called her the speaker and hoped the shortening did not offend. She was tall even for a Viharan, and her skin was the deep gray-green of a stone under moving water, and her eyes were set wide and low and did not blink, because Viharan eyes did not need to. She wore no ornament except a thin band of pale metal around one long arm, and Ila had learned, in her 2 years of study, that the band meant the speaker had lost family in the war. Every member of the delegation wore one. Some wore several. The speaker set both her hands flat on the table. This was how the Viharan began. Hands flat, palms down, offering the table the honest weight of the body. Corin, across from her, leaned back in his chair with one arm slung over its back. The session went badly from the first minute. Corin opened with a summary of the human position that he clearly considered generous, and the Viharan clearly considered an insult, though the insult was not in the terms. The terms were reasonable enough. The insult was in the delivery, in the way Corin spoke of the seam as a thing to be divided like a pie at a table, as if the border stars where 100,000 beings of both species had died were a matter of lines and percentages and a firm handshake at the end. Ila watched the speaker's hands. As Corin talked, the long gray fingers pressed harder against the table until the tips went pale. She did not know what that meant. She wished desperately that she knew what that meant. "We are prepared," Corin said, arriving at what he plainly considered the heart of it, "to withdraw our fleets from the inner seam entirely. Entirely. Your ships have the run of it. In exchange, we take administrative control of the 3 outer way stations, which, let us be honest, your people barely use, and we call it a border, and we all go home to grieve our dead in whatever fashion we prefer." He spread his hands. "That is a fair peace. That is more than fair. Any reasonable party would take it and thank us." The 3 outer way stations. Ila felt her stomach drop. She had flagged it. She had flagged it twice, in 2 memos that had gone into Corin's queue and she now understood had gone nowhere else. The 3 outer way stations were not barely used. They were the way stations that fed the Viharan border colonies, the long, slow supply chain that carried food and air and water out to the frontier worlds where the Viharan lived closest to the seam. In the archives, it looked like empty infrastructure. In life, it was a lifeline. Taking the way stations did not take a percentage of a pie. It put a hand around the throat of 11 million Viharan civilians and offered, very reasonably, very generously, not to squeeze too hard. The speaker lifted her hands off the table. Ila had never seen a Viharan do that in the middle of a session. The archives said it was how they ended a conversation. Hands down meant I am here and I am honest. Hands up meant there is nothing more to weigh. You do not know what you have asked for, the speaker said. Her translated voice came through the room system in a flat, clean human tone that stripped away whatever the original had carried, and even stripped, it was terrible. Or you know, and you have decided our children are a percentage. I have listened for 3 days to learn which of these is true. I no longer need to know. Both are the same to the ones who starve. Corin sat up. For the first time, the confidence on his face showed a crack. Speaker, if there's been a misunderstanding about the way stations, we can certainly discuss. You called our ride a waste of an afternoon. The speaker rose. When a Viharan rose, they rose the way a tide rises, without hurry and without any possibility of being stopped. Her 4 companions rose with her. We stood in your grief and named your dead. We wept in the way our bodies weep for beings not our own, and you counted the minutes. She looked at him with those wide, unblinking eyes. A people who cannot spare an afternoon for the dead will not spare a lifetime for the living. We came here to end a war. We find we have been trading with a merchant who does not know the difference between a border and a hand at the throat. There is nothing more to weigh. Speaker, Corin was standing now too, and his voice had lost its polish. If you walk out of this room, the ceasefire ends with you. You understand that. The guns come back online the moment your shuttle clears the dock. Is that what you want? You want to go back to the seam and bury more children over a misunderstanding your own pride won't let you fix. It was the worst thing he could have said, and Ila knew it in her bones before the translation finished carrying it across the table. The speaker went very still, and then she said the thing that would, in the weeks and years to come, be repeated across 1,000 worlds, the thing that every Viharan child would learn as the last words spoken by their people to the human who had wasted an afternoon. Then let the guns come back online, she said. We would rather die honest than live inside your arithmetic. We do not fear your fleets. We have feared them for 40 years and we are tired of it, and a tired people fears nothing, because fear is a thing you spend and we have nothing left to spend. Go back to your world, merchant, and tell them the Viharan walked out. Tell them we chose the dark over your table. And when your grandchildren ask why there was never peace, tell them the truth. Tell them a man could not spare an afternoon. She turned. The delegation turned with her, that slow, inevitable tide, and they walked toward the tall doors of the chamber, and no one in the human delegation moved to stop them, because there was nothing left to say and Corin had said it. Ila stood. She did not decide to stand. Later, when people asked her, she would say that honestly, that she had not decided, that her body had simply refused to sit while 11 million people walked out of a room to die. She stood, and the motion caught the speaker's eye, the smallest turn of that great gray head, and for 1/2 of 1 second the young human envoy and the alien who had just ended the war looked at each other across the length of the ancient table. Ila did not speak. She was not permitted to speak, but she brought her hands up, both of them, palms out, the Viharan gesture for there is nothing more to weigh, and she held them there, and she let her face do the thing her voice was forbidden to do. She let it grieve. The speaker looked at her for that 1/2 a second. Something moved behind the wide, unblinking eyes, something Ila could not read and would spend a long time trying to. Then the tide went out through the doors, and the doors closed, and the war was back. Corin sat down heavily. His aides were already talking, low and fast, and the word Ila heard most was strike, and the second most was window, as in window of opportunity, As in the enemy is off balance and we should hit them while they are. She was still standing with her hands half raised. Slowly she lowered them. Through the tall window of the chamber, far below, the Viharan shuttle detached from its cradle and lit its engines, a small blue star pulling away from the dead gray one. And somewhere in the human fleet, in the great ships strung out along the seam like beads on a wire, targeting systems that had been dark for 11 days began, one by one, to wake. Ila Wren watched the little blue star shrink toward the black, and she understood, with a clarity that felt almost like calm, that everything that happened next would be decided in the next few hours by people who had not been in the room, and that she was the only person who had been in the room who understood what the room had actually said. She turned and walked out of the gallery before the strike planners could see her face. She had somewhere to be. She had a message to write, and almost no time to write it, and no authority whatsoever to send it. That had never stopped her before. She was too young to have learned how much it should. The assistant envoy's quarters aboard Cradle Halo were a narrow room with a bunk, a desk, and a viewport the size of a dinner plate. Ila sat at the desk with her hands flat on its surface, palms down, and realized only after a moment that she had put them there in the Viharan way. She left them there. Her authority was small. She was an assistant envoy on her first negotiation, seconded from the analysis corps because someone at Fleet had decided that a person who had actually read about the Viharan ought to be in the room. That was the whole of her power. She could read. She could recommend. She could not order a single ship to do a single thing. When the ceasefire ended, as it now had, the decision of what came next belonged to the fleet commander at the seam, a woman named Admiral Osai, and above her to the War Council on Earth, and to none of it did Ila Wren belong. But she had one thing. She had a communications line to Admiral Osai's staff, opened at the start of the talks so that the negotiating team could pass real-time updates to the fleet. It was meant for reporting. It was not meant for arguing. Ila intended to use it for arguing, and she intended to do it before the strike planners in the gallery finished writing the case for the opposite. She opened the line and began to record. "Admiral Osai," she said, "this is Ila Wren, Assistant Envoy Cradle Halo. The talks have collapsed. You know that by now. Within the hour, you will receive a recommendation from Senior Envoy Corrin's staff to exploit the ceasefire's end with an immediate strike on Viharan positions in the inner seam. I am recording this to tell you that recommendation is wrong, and I am going to tell you why, and I am going to be brief, because I know you are already reading the range plots." She stopped. She had to get this right. She had exactly one chance to be listened to by a woman who had every reason to file her under the noise of an overexcited junior. "The Viharan did not walk out because they think they can win," she said. "They walked out because we asked for the 3 outer way stations, and the 3 outer way stations are the supply line that feeds 11 million Viharan civilians on the frontier worlds. In the archives it looks like empty infrastructure. It is not. It is food and air and water for the border colonies. Senior Envoy Corrin asked them as a term of peace to hand us the throat of their own children. He did not know it. I flagged it twice. It went nowhere. That is the misunderstanding that ended the talks, and I want you to sit with the fact that it is a misunderstanding, because everything I am about to ask you to do depends on you believing that no one on the other side of that table is a monster. They are a tired, grieving people who were offered a choice between slow starvation and open death, and they chose death because at least death is honest. That is not the behavior of an enemy who thinks they can win. That is the behavior of an enemy who has stopped being afraid, and an enemy who has stopped being afraid is the most dangerous kind there is, and the last kind you want to hit while their guard is down, because they will not thank you for it and they will never, ever forget." She breathed. "I'm not going to tell you what to do with your fleet. That is not my place and we both know it. I am going to tell you what I would do, and then you will do what you judge best. If we strike now, We win the seam in a month and we lose the Viharan for a century, because we will have proven that every word the speaker said about us was true, that we are merchants who count minutes over the dead and hit people while they weep. If we honor the ceasefire even though they walked out of it, even though no treaty binds us to a single hour of it, then we do something they do not have a category for. We become the party who did the honest thing when the dishonest thing was free. To the Viharan, that is the only currency that means anything. They do not trust words. They trust what you do when doing costs you everything and saying would have cost you nothing. Right now the cheap thing, the free thing, is to shoot. So don't, please. Hold the line and shoot nothing, and let me try to find the door that Corin slammed, because I promise you it is still there. Ren out. She sent it before she could reconsider, and then she sat in the narrow room and shook for a while, quietly, the way a person shakes after they have done a thing that cannot be taken back. The reply did not come for 4 hours. In those 4 hours, the war resumed. Not in fire, not yet, but in the 10,000 small motions that precede fire. Ila, watching the fleet feed on her desk display, saw the human ships along the seam shift from the loose drifting formation of a ceasefire into the tight geometry of a force that expects to fight. She saw the Viharan do the same across the invisible line, their vessels drawing together, their frontier stations going dark to hide their emissions. 2 great tired fleets, feeling for each other in the dark, each certain the other would strike first, each right to be certain, because that was how these things always went. Someone flinched, and then everyone died for a while, and then they buried the flinch and called it strategy. She did not sleep. She read. She pulled everything the analysis corps had on the border colonies, the frontier world strung along the far side of the seam, and she built a picture she wished she had built before the talks began, because if she had, maybe she could have handed it to Corin in a form even he could not ignore. The picture was worse than she had feared. The way stations were not merely a supply line. They were a supply line that was already failing. The war had strangled Viharan shipping for 2 years, and the frontier colonies had been living on reserves and rationing for most of it. The outermost world, a cold place the Viharan called something that translated roughly as last water, was 3 weeks from running out of the nutrient stock its population depended on. 3 weeks. Ila checked the number twice, then a third time, because it changed everything. It meant the speaker had not walked out over pride. She had walked out over a clock. Somewhere behind that flat translated voice and those unblinking eyes had been the knowledge that her people on last water were counting days, and that the humans across the table were offering, as generosity, to take the one thing that might still save them. No wonder the words had cost her nothing. When your children are 3 weeks from the end, there is nothing left to be diplomatic with. And it meant something else. It meant that the thing Ila had asked Osai to do, to hold and do nothing, was not enough. Holding the line saved no one on last water. Holding was the beginning. It was not the answer. The answer, when it came to her, arrived the way the decision to stand had arrived, without deliberation, fully formed, as if it had been waiting in her the whole time for the moment she would stop being afraid to look at it. Feed them. Not as a term, not as a trade, not I will give you food if you give me a border, because that was just the throat grip in a friendlier coat, and the Viharan would see through it in a heartbeat and be right too. Feed them for nothing. Open a corridor through the seam, through the very space where 2 fleets were right now sharpening their geometry at each other, and run food to last water and the other frontier worlds, and ask for nothing in return, and do it while the war was technically back on, and do it even though they had walked out, and do it even though every strategist in the human fleet would call it insane. Because it was the one thing the Viharan had no category for. She could hear Corin's voice in her head already, and the voices of the strategists behind him. You want to send unarmed supply ships through a live war zone to feed the enemy that just walked out on us. You want to spend human resources, human risk, human ships, to keep alive the very population whose government just told us they'd rather die than deal. Do you understand what you are asking? And the answer was yes. She understood exactly what she was asking, and she understood that it was the only move on the board that could not be read as a trick, because no one plays a trick that costs them everything and gains them nothing. The Viharan measured a person by what they did when saying was cheap and doing was ruin. She was proposing to do the most ruinous, least profitable, most honest thing a species could do, and she was betting the whole piece on the chance that a tired, grieving people would recognize it for what it was. She thought in the waiting about her own reasons. It was worth doing, she decided, to know why you were about to risk everything, so that if it failed you at least understood what it had failed for. She had not lost anyone at the seam. She said that to herself plainly, because it mattered. She had no dead to avenge and no dead to honor and no personal debt in the great ledger of the war. She had grown up on a quiet inner world where the war was a thing on the feeds, a thing that happened to other people's families, a distant weather. She had gone into the analysis corps because she was good at reading, and she had asked to study the Viharan because they were the thing no one understood, and understanding the thing no one understood had felt, to a young mind, like the most useful shape a life could take. And in 2 years of reading, something had happened that she had not expected and had never told anyone. She had come to like them, not in spite of the war, alongside it. She had read their poetry, what little of it survived translation, and their laws, and the transcripts of their own internal arguments captured by intelligence and filed and forgotten, and she had found in them a people who valued the same thing over and over, in 100 different forms, which was the gap between what a being said and what a being did, and who had built an entire civilization around the conviction that the second was the only true measure of the first. It was, she had come to think, a beautiful thing to build a civilization around. It was also, she had come to think, exactly the thing her own species was worst at, and exactly the thing that had made the war impossible to end, because every human overture had been words, and the Viharan did not buy words, and no one on the human side had ever understood that they were offering a currency the other side did not accept. She was not risking everything for a stranger's cause, she decided. She was risking it because she had spent 2 years learning to see a people clearly, and having seen them clearly, she could not unsee them, and a person who has seen the drowning clearly cannot walk past the water. That was all. It was not noble. It was just what happened when you looked long enough at someone to stop being able to look away. The reply from Admiral Osei came at the 4th hour. It was text, not voice, and it was short, and Ila read it standing up because she could not make herself sit. Envoy Ren, I have read your message 4 times. I have also read the strike recommendation from your senior envoy's staff, which is competent, aggressive, and correct in every particular except the one that matters, which is the one you named. I have held the fleet. No human ship will fire first. I have taken heat for this from the War Council, and I will take more. Understand that I have bought you nothing but time, and not much of it, because a held fleet is a coiled fleet, and coils do not hold forever. If you have a next move, envoy, make it fast, and make it something I can defend to a council that wants blood. I am listening, Osei. Ila read it twice, and on the second reading her hand stopped shaking. She had time. Not much. A held fleet, a coiled fleet. She had bought the space of a held breath, and in that space she had to do the impossible thing, which was to convince the human chain of command to run a mercy convoy into a war zone, and then to convince the Viharan to let it through, and the second was harder than the first, because the Viharan had every reason to believe any human ship crossing the seam was a bomb wearing a bread basket. She began, immediately, to write the second message, the one to Osei that would lay out the convoy. And she began, at the same time, in a separate window, to compose the thing she was not authorized to compose at all, the thing that no assistant envoy had any business drafting, which was a message to the Viharan. She did not have a channel to them. The negotiating channel had gone dark when the delegation's shuttle cleared the dock. But she knew the frequency the speaker's ship had used, and she knew that the ship had not yet jumped, because the fleet feed still showed it. A lone blue mark pulling slowly out of Cradle Halo's gravity well toward the point where it would fold into the deep dark and carry the news of the walkout home. If she was going to reach the speaker, it had to be now before that fold, and it had to be over an open, unsecured line that half the human fleet could hear, and it had to be the truth, because the speaker had made it very clear that the truth, spoken when a lie would have been easier, was the only thing that would ever move her. Ila Wren opened the channel to the Viharan ship, on a frequency she had no clearance to use, with a message she had no authority to send, and she did the second reckless thing she had done that day, and it was much larger than standing up in a room. She hailed the enemy. For a long moment there was nothing, only the soft hiss of an open line reaching out across the widening dark toward a ship that had every reason not to answer. She watched the blue mark on the feed and willed it to slow, to turn, to do anything but fold away into silence and carry the war home in its belly. And then the line clicked, and a flat, clean, translated voice, the same terrible stripped-down voice from the chamber, came into the narrow room where a 27-year-old woman sat with her palms pressed flat against a desk. "You are the one who stood," the speaker said, "the young one who wept without words and raised her hands. I told my ship to answer only if it was you." A pause. "Speak, human, and know that I am very tired and that tired people have no patience for merchants. If you have come to bargain, I will close this line and you will never open it again. So choose your next words as though they are the last you will ever say to me, because they may be." Ila did not bargain. She had already decided she would not, but hearing the warning made the decision feel like standing on the edge of something high. "I am not here to bargain," she said. "I know that if I try, you will close the line and you will be right to. So I am going to tell you a true thing, and then I am going to tell you what I am going to do about it, and I am not going to ask you for anything in return, because there is nothing you have that I want more than for you to believe me. Is that acceptable?" A silence, then continue. "The true thing is this. My envoy did not know what the way stations were. I did. I flagged it twice and no one read it. That is not an excuse for him. A man who ends a war should read everything, and he did not, and the fault is his, and I will not pretend otherwise to make my own people look better. But I want you to know that when he asked for the way stations, he did not know he was asking for the throat of last water. He thought he was drawing a line on a map. He is not a monster. He is a proud man who did not do his reading, and proud men who do not do their reading have started most of the wars in the history of my species, and probably yours." She paused. "I know last water has 3 weeks of nutrient stock. I know the other frontier worlds are not much better. I have read the numbers your ship is trying to keep us from reading, and I am telling you I have read them so that you understand I am not guessing at your pain. I have counted your days." The line was very quiet. On the feed, the blue mark had stopped moving toward the fold point. It hung in the dark, waiting. "That is a great deal of truth," the speaker said at last, "for a human to spend on a person who cannot pay for it. Why?" "Because here is what I am going to do," Ila said. "I am going to try to convince my fleet to open a corridor through the seam and run food to last water and the other frontier worlds. Unarmed ships, full of nutrient stock and water reclaimers and whatever your colonies need most, which you are going to have to tell me because I will guess wrong and people will die in the gap between my guess and the truth. I am going to ask for nothing in return. Not the way stations, not a border, not a treaty, not a single word of thanks. If, after your children have eaten, you still wish to go home and continue the war, you may, and we will not have fed you a bomb, and we will not have used the corridor to move troops, and you may inspect every ship on the way in and on the way out with your own people aboard, and the moment you see a weapon you may turn the whole convoy around and I will not blame you." She took a breath. I am telling you this now, over an open line that half my own fleet can hear, so that I cannot take it back. So that if I fail to convince my command, you will know that at least one human tried and tried out loud, where it cost her everything to be heard trying. That is why I am spending the truth on you, because you told me in the chamber that you trust what a person does when saying is cheap and doing is ruin. So I am doing the thing that is ruin. And I am doing it first, before you have promised me anything, because that is the only way you will ever believe it is real. The silence that followed was the longest of Ila's life. She sat in the narrow room and watched the blue mark hang in the dark, and listened to the soft hiss of the open line, and she thought about all the ways this could be nothing. Could be a young woman shouting into a void at a people who had every reason to fold away and go home and bury more children and never think of her again. When the speaker spoke, her flat translated voice had changed. Ila could not have said how. The system stripped the tone away. But something came through anyway, the way grief had come through in the chamber, and it was not agreement, and it was not refusal. It was disbelief. Careful, wounded, 40 years of war disbelief. You understand, the speaker said slowly, that if this is a trick, it is the cruelest trick a species has ever played on mine. You understand that we have children looking at empty stores, and that to raise their hope, and then let a convoy of your warships slip through under the flag of bread would break something in my people that no treaty could ever set again. You understand that you are asking me to gamble the last hope of 11 million beings on the honesty of a human I met 3 days ago across a table, where another human called our dead a waste of an afternoon. I understand all of it, Ila said, and that is exactly why I am not asking you to gamble anything. I am asking you to let me act first. You risk nothing until my ships are in your space, and the moment they are, you hold every card. You inspect them. You crew them with your own people. You keep your fleet at the ready the entire time, and if we so much as twitch wrong, you end it. I'm not asking for your trust, speaker. Trust is a thing you spend, and you told me your people have nothing left to spend. I'm asking you to let me spend mine. Let me put my ships and my people and my whole career and possibly my life inside your reach, where you can crush all of it in a heartbeat, and then watch what I do. Judge me by that, not by my words, by what I do when doing is ruin. Another silence, and then the speaker said a thing that Ila would carry for the rest of her life. You have used my own teaching against me, she said, and there was something in the flat voice that might, in a Viharan throat, have been the ghost of warmth. That is either the mark of a very honest person or a very dangerous one. I do not yet know which, but I find that after 40 years, I would rather be broken by hoping than survive by refusing to hope. My people have done nothing but refuse to hope for 2 generations, and look where our caution has brought us. To an empty room and a walked-out piece and a clock counting down on last water. A pause. So I will do a reckless thing too, young human, and match your ruin with mine. I will hold my fleet where it is, and I will tell my colonies that food may be coming, and I will not fold away into the dark. I will give you the manifest of what last water needs. And I will send you the coordinates of a corridor through the seam that my ships will not fire into, so long as yours carry no weapon and no soldier. This is not peace. Understand me. This is not a treaty, and it is not forgiveness, and it does not undo what your merchant said about our dead. This is one tired person deciding to watch what another does. That is all it is. That is everything, Ila said. That is more than everything, thank you. Do not thank me yet, the speaker said. Thank me when last water eats, or curse me if you have lied. The manifest is coming. Do not fail, human. There are children counting the days, and now they are counting yours. The line clicked shut. Ila sat back. Her heart was going like a hammer. She had done it. She had done the reckless thing, and it had held. And now all she had to do was the part that was actually impossible, which was to convince her own chain of command to hand her unarmed ships and let her run them into a war zone to feed the enemy. She wrote to Osai. She sent the whole of it, the recording of the call, the manifest as it arrived from the Viharan ship, the corridor coordinates, everything. She laid it out plainly and asked for a decision, and then she went to find Corin because whatever happened next, she would not let it happen behind his back. He was her senior envoy. He had failed, and his failure had started this, but she would not fail the same way by cutting a man out of a room to make herself the hero of it. That was not the honest thing. And she had just told a grieving alien that she lived by the honest thing, out loud, over an open line, where she could not take it back. She found him in the gallery, alone now, the strike planners gone. He was standing at the tall window watching the scene, and he looked, for the first time since she had met him, like a man who was not certain of anything. They held the fleet, he said without turning. Osai held the fleet, on the word of an assistant envoy. Do you have any idea how far outside procedure that is? Yes, Ila said. I have negotiated 4 treaties, Corin said. 4, and I have never once had a delegation walk out on me, not once. I built a whole career on being the man they don't walk out on. He turned. His face was not angry. That surprised her. It was old, suddenly, and tired, and something underneath the tiredness that she had not expected to see, which was shame. And I lost this one in 90 minutes because I couldn't spare an afternoon for a bowl of water. You flagged it, twice. I read your name on the memos and I thought she's an analyst. Analysts see problems everywhere, that's their job, and I filed you under noise. He shook his head slowly. You stood up. In the session, I saw you. You raised your hands the way they do. I didn't even know what it meant, and you did, and I was the senior envoy. He laughed once without any humor in it. Tell me what you're doing, Ren. I know you're doing something. Osai doesn't hold a fleet for a memo. Tell me, and tell me straight, because I have done enough damage for one war, and I would like, before the end, to do one thing right, even if the only right thing left to me is to get out of the way of the person who should have had my chair. So she told him. All of it. The call, the corridor, the convoy, the manifest, the plan to feed last water and ask for nothing. And she watched a proud man listen to a plan that made his entire career look like a wrong turn, and she watched him do the hard thing, the thing that cost him everything and gained him nothing, which was to nod. It's insane, Corin said when she finished. You know that. Unarmed ships live war zone feeding the people who walked out on us. The council will scream. Half the fleet will call it treason. He was quiet a moment. It's also the only thing I've heard in 3 days that sounds like peace instead of arithmetic. He straightened, and some old competence came back into him, not the bluster, something better, the thing the bluster had been standing in front of all along. You'll need cover. Political cover, up the chain, or the council kills it before the first ship loads. Osai can hold the fleet, but she can't authorize a mercy convoy into enemy space on her own hook. That needs a senior envoy's signature. He looked at her. It needs mine, which is, at this moment, the only thing my rank is still good for. He held out his hand for her slate. Give it here, Ren. Let the man who wasted the afternoon spend his signature buying back 1 hour of it. It's the last useful thing I've got. Corin's signature bought the hour. It did not buy peace on the human side. It bought a war. The War Council on Earth received the proposal the way a body receives a splinter, with alarm and a strong urge to expel it. Ila was not present for the sessions, which happened across a light tower of distance, and in rooms she would never be permitted to enter, but she heard the shape of them in the messages that came back down the chain to Osai, and Osai, to her lasting credit, forwarded them to Ila unedited, so that the young envoy would know exactly what her plan was costing the people defending it. They called it appeasement. They called it feeding the hand that had struck them. They called it a propaganda victory for the Viharan, who would take the food and laugh, and continue the war fattened on human charity. One counselor, a man whose son had died at the seam, called it an insult to the dead, and Ila did not have an answer for him that would have helped, because he was not wrong that it was a hard thing to feed the people whose fleet had killed his son. She only believed, in the place beneath argument, that the dead were not honored by making more of them, and that the counselor's son would not eat again no matter how many Viharan children starved, and that the only question left to the living was whether the killing stopped with this generation or was handed down like a debt to the next. Osai held the line in those rooms the way she had held it in the dark. Ila learned later some of what the admiral had said, and one line of it stayed with her. When a counselor demanded to know what the fleet would gain from the convoy, Osai was said to have answered, "Nothing. That is the point. If we gain something, they would never believe it. The only gift they will accept is the one we cannot possibly profit from." And she was said to have added, more quietly, that she had buried enough of her own crews to know that a victory in the seam would taste like ash, and that she would rather explain a strange mercy to the council than write one more letter to one more mother. In the end, the council did not approve the convoy, nor did they forbid it. They did the thing that large frightened bodies do when they cannot agree, which was to fail to decide, and to leave the deciding to the people closest to the thing, which meant Osai and Korin, and a 27-year-old assistant envoy who had hailed the enemy over an open line. It was not a victory. It was the absence of a veto. Ila learned to be grateful for the absence of vetoes. In the machinery of great powers, the absence of a no is sometimes the closest thing to a yes that mercy ever gets. The convoy assembled at a fleet depot 2 days out from the seam. It was not much to look at, and that was the point. 9 ships, old bulk haulers pulled off cargo routes, their weapon hardpoints not merely powered down but physically removed, the empty mounts left open and visible so that any inspector could see the absence with their own eyes. Ila insisted on that. It was not enough to be unarmed. They had to be unarmed in a way a suspicious stranger could verify at a glance in the dark under stress, with children counting days behind them. She had learned that from the speaker, without the speaker ever saying it. Do not ask to be trusted. Make the truth so plain that trust becomes unnecessary. She insisted on one more thing, and this one cost her an argument with Osai that she nearly lost. She insisted on going aboard the lead ship herself. "You are the one person who cannot be replaced," Osai told her over the link, and the admiral's weathered face was drawn tight with the particular frustration of a commander whose best asset will not stay behind cover. "If this goes wrong, if a single hothead on either side fires a single shot, that convoy is gone and you with it, and there is no one else who has the line to the speaker or the standing with my council or the fool's luck to have gotten this far. Stay on Cradle Halo. Run it from here. That is an order I am within my rights to give." "With respect, Admiral," Ila said, "it is not, and we both know it because I am an envoy and not under your command, which is the one time in my life that technicality is going to be useful to me." She softened. "I have to go. Not because I don't trust the crews, because the speaker has to see me go. She told me to judge a person by what they do when doing is ruin. If I stay safe on the station and send other people's children into the corridor while I run it from a chair, then I am exactly the merchant she walked out on. Safe words and other people's risk. She would see it in an instant, and she would be right to. The only way the convoy means what I need it to mean is if I am on it. If I am inside her reach where she can crush me, doing the thing I said I would do." She paused. "Let me go, Admiral. I promise you I am not being brave. I am being consistent. It is the only weapon I have, and it only works if I never put it down." Osei was quiet for a long moment. "You are a very difficult young woman," she said finally. "I hope your children are exactly like you, and I hope you have to raise them. Go, and Ren, if a Viharan ship tells you to stop, you stop. You do not argue, you do not explain, you stop and you open every door and you let them see. Do you understand? Their fear is the enemy now, not their fleet. Their fear. Do nothing that feeds it." "I understand," Ila said. "Fear is a thing you spend. I am going to try very hard not to make them spend any." The convoy crossed into the seam at the coordinates the speaker had sent. Ila stood on the bridge of the lead hauler, an old ship named Dorland's Reach after a captain no one aboard remembered, and she watched the corridor open ahead of them, a lane of nominally empty space bounded on both sides by the hidden geometry of 2 fleets that could end everything in a heartbeat. The human ships behind her, coiled at the seam's edge, did not follow. That had been the agreement, and Os kept it to the meter. No warship crossed. Only the 9 unarmed haulers moving slowly, all their systems open, broadcasting on every band a plain, repeating message. Nutrient convoy, no weapons aboard, bound for the frontier colonies, all doors open to inspection. We will stop on your word. The Viharan were waiting. They came out of the dark the way the speaker had come out of her chair, without hurry and without any possibility of being stopped. 3 warships sliding into the corridor ahead of the convoy, vast and gray-green and bristling, in a way the little haulers could never answer. Ila's bridge crew went very still. She could feel the fear in the room, the animal certainty that they were 9 unarmed ships under the guns of an enemy fleet, which was precisely what they were. The lead Viharan ship hailed. The voice was not the speaker's. Human convoy, you will hold position. You will open all compartments. Inspection parties will board. Any resistance, any closed door, any weapon, and this corridor closes and does not open again. Confirm. Confirmed, Ila said before anyone else could speak. All ships, this is Envoy Ren. Hold position, open everything. Do not close a single door, do not reach for anything. Let them see all of it. Confirm down the line. One by one, the 9 haulers confirmed and stopped, and opened themselves to the dark and the guns and the boarding parties and waited. While the inspection parties worked, Ila did a thing she had not planned. She walked the ship with them. Not to supervise, not to hurry them, but to be present, to put her own body in the compartments they searched so that whatever they found, she found beside them, so that there was no door she stood behind while they opened it. I would have called it another needless risk, and it was, and Ila did it anyway, because she had come to understand that risk shared was the only currency the Viharan would spend, and she meant to spend every coin she had. One of the inspectors, younger than the others or at least smaller, followed her through the aft hold for a while without speaking. Ila let the silence sit. She had learned that much. Finally the inspector spoke, its translated voice careful and low. You crossed the seam in a ship with no guns, it said. You must have known that if the order came from your fleet, we would end you before you could turn around. You had no defense. None. Why would a person do that? Because a person with a defense is a person you have to wonder about, Ila said. She kept her hands loose and visible, the way you keep your hands around a frightened animal. If I had come armed, you would spend the whole time we were here watching my guns instead of watching my hands. You would never be able to believe me because you would always be able to imagine the moment I turned. So I took the guns away. Now there is nothing for you to watch except what I actually do. That is the only gift I had to give you. The gift of not having to wonder. The inspector was quiet for a long moment, its wide eyes moving over the pallets of nutrient stock stacked to the hold ceiling. There is a word my people have, it said at last, for a being who removes their own defenses so that another does not have to fear them. It is a very old word. We have not had cause to use it about your kind, not once in 40 years. It did not say the word. Ila did not ask. Some things she was learning were made smaller by being spoken, and this was one, and she let it stay large. The inspection took 6 hours. The Viharan were thorough in a way that told Ila everything about how much hung on this, how badly they needed it to be real and how little they dared to believe it. They went through every compartment of every ship. They cut open sealed containers of nutrient stock and tested the contents, wary of poison. They traced power conduits looking for hidden systems. They stripped panels. They found, aboard Dorland's Reach, in a locker near the bridge, the one thing that nearly ended it all, and Ila's heart stopped when the boarding officer's translated voice came sharp over the link. There is a weapon aboard, a sidearm, in a locker on the command deck. You said no weapons. You said all doors open, all weapons removed. You lied. The bridge went cold. Ila felt every eye turn to her. Show me, she said quietly. Bring it to me. Now. The Viharan officer came onto the bridge, tall and gray-green and radiating a fury that was really terror wearing armor, and in one long hand it held a sidearm, a standard human emergency pistol, the kind bolted into a locker on every ship in the fleet by regulation, the kind no one had thought to remove because no one thinks to remove the thing that is always simply there. Ila looked at it, and she understood in that frozen moment that the whole piece, 11 million lives, 40 years of war, hung on what she did in the next 10 seconds, and that any word she spent explaining that it was standard, that it was regulation, that it was an oversight and not a lie, would be exactly the sound of a merchant spending words to buy his way out of a thing his own carelessness had caused. The speaker would hear it a system away. Do not explain, do the thing. She held out her hand. The officer, wary, did not give her the weapon. You are right, Ila said. We said no weapons. There is a weapon. It does not matter that it is regulation. It does not matter that we forgot it. We said a true thing and then we were careless with the truth, and carelessness with the truth is how this entire war restarted, and I will not do it again in front of you. She turned to her own crew. Every ship. Search every locker, every emergency kit, every regulation stowage right now with the Viharan parties watching, and bring every weapon on all 9 ships to the command deck. All of it. Do not tell me it is standard. I know it is standard. Bring it anyway. They found 11 regulation sidearms, tucked in 11 lockers, forgotten by 11 crews. And Ila had the whole lot of them brought to the open airlock of Dorland's Reach, and she stood there with the Viharan officer beside her, and she vented all 11 weapons into the dark of the seam, one after another, watching them tumble away into the black where they could hurt no one. And she did it slowly, and she did it in full view of the boarding parties and the warships, and she knew the speaker. Now there are no weapons, she said. Not standard ones, not forgotten ones, not one. Inspect again, take all night, and I am sorry. Not for a trick, because there was no trick, but for the carelessness, because you have been given too many careless humans and you deserved a careful one. She looked at the officer. Tell your speaker what I did, not what I said, what I did. That is the only report that matters. The officer looked at her for a long moment, with its wide, unblinking eyes. Then it lowered its weapon and reached up and touched the thin, pale band around its own long arm, the band that meant it too had lost family to the war, and it said, in a voice the translator could not strip of everything, I will tell her. I will tell her exactly what you did. And it turned and went to finish the inspection, and the corridor stayed open, and the convoy, 6 hours later, cleared to move again, began the long, slow run toward last water with the guns of the Viharan fleet escorting it in, no longer as jailers, but though no one yet dared to say the word, as something closer to an honor guard. Last water was a cold world. It hung under a small red sun at the far frayed edge of Viharan space, and from orbit it looked like a stone that someone had tried and failed to warm, its seas locked in gray ice, its habitable band a thin ribbon of settlement clinging to the equator where the cold relented just enough for life. Ila watched it grow in the viewport of Dorland's Reach and thought that a people who could make a home on a world like this were a people who understood in their bones what it meant to run out of margin. There had never been much margin on last water. That was the whole story of the place, and the war had taken what little there was. On the way down, in the last hour before the ships reached atmosphere, Ila sat in the dim cargo bay of Dorland's Reach among the pallets, and she let herself, finally, be afraid. She had not let herself be afraid before then. There had been no room for it, no hour to spare, and fear was a thing you spent, and she had needed everything for the doing. But now the doing was almost complete, the corridor behind her, the world ahead, and in the small gap between the risk taken and the risk resolved, the fear she had held off for 9 days arrived all at once, and she sat with it in the dark. She was afraid that the nutrient stock would be wrong, that her guess at the manifest, corrected by the speaker but still translated across a gulf of biology neither species fully understood, would prove subtly poisonous, that she would feed last water something that looked like food and worked like slow harm, and that the first great act of trust between their peoples would end with human bread killing Viharan children, which would be worse, infinitely worse, than if she had done nothing at all. She was afraid the colony's people, driven half-mad by hunger and hope, would rush the ships when the doors opened and be crushed in the crowd. She was afraid of 1,000 small mechanical failures, a ramp that would not lower, a container that would not open, some idiot piece of machinery choosing this hour of all hours to fail. She was afraid, most of all, of the thing she could not name, the possibility that she had misread the whole of it, that the Viharan were not what 2 years of reading had told her they were, and that she had led 9 ships and their crews into a trap dressed as a colony. She let the fear come, and she looked at it, and then she did with it what she had learned to do with everything in the last 9 days. She asked what it wanted her to do, and she found that it wanted her to turn around, and so she knew that turning around was wrong, because fear only ever pointed away from the door, and the whole of her life, she was coming to understand, had been about walking toward doors that fear wanted shut. She rose from the pallets and went forward to the airlock and stood there as the ship came down through the gray clouds of last water, and by the time the ramp touched frozen ground, she had spent the fear entirely, the way you spend the last of something you will not need again, without regret, because where she was going there would be no more room for it than there had been before. The convoy came down into the great receiving field outside the colony's central dome, escorted by Viharan ships, and Ila stepped out of the airlock onto the frost-cracked ground and found the entire colony waiting. They did not cheer. Ila had half expected cheering in the human way, and there was none, and she understood after a moment that the Viharan did not cheer, that cheering was a spending of noise, and these were people who had learned to spend nothing. Instead they stood, thousands of them, in a vast silent ring around the field, and as the cargo doors opened and the first pallets of nutrient stock came down the ramps, the Viharan of last water did a thing that Ila had read about once, in an archive entry she had not fully understood until this moment. They knelt and they pressed their long hands flat against the frozen ground, palms down, all of them, thousands of them, the gesture that meant I am here and I am honest, the gesture the speaker had made at the start of every session, the gesture Ila had found herself making alone in a narrow room. They pressed their hands to the ground as if to tell the world itself the honest weight of their bodies, and they held them there in silence while the food came down. And Ila realized she was watching a people say thank you in the only language they had ever fully trusted, the language of what you do when saying is not enough. She knelt too. She did not decide to. Her body did it the way it had stood in the chamber. She knelt on the frozen ground of last water among a people who had been her enemy 9 days ago, and she pressed her human hands flat against the frost, palms down, and she stayed there while the ships that had crossed a war zone to reach this place gave up their cargo, and she wept, in the human way, openly, and no one told her it was a waste of an afternoon. The speaker found her there. Ila did not know how the speaker had come to last water. She learned later that the delegation ship had turned around before it ever reached the fold point, that the speaker had chosen to follow the convoy in rather than carry the news of the walkout home, and that this choice had been its own kind of ruin, its own bet placed before any promise, because if the convoy had been a bomb, the speaker would have died with the world it destroyed. She had matched Ila's risk with her own after all. She had put herself inside the humans' reach exactly as the human had put herself inside the Viharans. Neither of them had asked the other to. That, Ila would understand only much later, was the moment the peace had actually been made, though it would take months of talks to write it down. The speaker knelt beside her on the frost. For a while neither of them spoke. There was nothing to weigh, and both of them, in their different ways, knew that this was the one silence that did not need filling. "My officer told me what you did," the speaker said at last, "with the weapons. He did not tell me what you said because I asked him not to. I told him I did not care what you said. The wide, unblinking eyes turned toward the young human. I care that when you found you had been careless with the truth, you did not spend a single word defending yourself. You emptied your ships into the dark slowly where I could see. You made the truth so plain that trust became unnecessary. A pause. You learned that from me, from my own teaching thrown back across a table. I have taught it to my own people for 40 years and watched them fail to live it under the weight of their fear. And a human I met 9 days ago lived it in 6 hours, with children counting the days behind her. I do not know what to do with that, envoy. I have been at war with your kind since before you were born. I made a home for my hatred. I furnished it. And you have made it very difficult to go on living there. The war doesn't have to end today, Ila said quietly. The food is here. That's all that had to happen today. The rest can wait until your people have eaten and slept and stopped counting days. I didn't feed last water to win a treaty. I fed it because your children were hungry and mine could stop them being hungry, and there is no arithmetic in that. If you want to go home after this and continue the war, I told you that you could, and I meant it. I will not have bought your peace with bread. Bread that buys is not a gift, it is a lever, and I promised you no levers. I know, the speaker said. That is why there will be peace. She rose, that slow, inevitable tide, and she looked out over the kneeling colony and the descending pallets and the human ships that had come with open doors. Not because you bought it, because you refused to. My people are watching this, envoy. Every Viharan world is watching it. The convoy that carried no weapon and asked for no border. The human who emptied her ships into the dark rather than spend a word in her own defense. The one who knelt on the frost of last water and wept for children not her own. She was quiet a moment. We do not cheer, but we remember. We remember for generations. Your merchant will be remembered too, the one who could not spare an afternoon, and his name will be a warning our children learn. But yours will be something else. Yours will be the story we tell when someone says a species cannot change, that an enemy is only ever an enemy, that the strong always squeeze the throat because they can. We will point to the frost of last water and say, no. Once, a strong people held their fire when firing was free, and fed us when they owed us nothing, and stood inside our guns unarmed rather than ask us to trust their words. Once the humans walked toward the door we slammed and held it open with their own hands. That is what we will tell them. That is the story. It became exactly that. The formal piece took 4 months to write, and it was written not at Cradle Halo but at last water, at the request of the Viharan, who said that a piece should be signed on the ground where it was actually made rather than in a ring of stone orbiting a dead star. The terms, when they came, surprised the Human War Council, which had braced for the Viharan to press their advantage now that they knew the humans could be moved by conscience. They did not press. They gave more than they took. When a counselor asked the speaker why, across the long table on the frost, she was said to have answered that a people who feeds you when you have walked out on them is a people you do not need to guard against, and that the whole purpose of a border is to keep out the ones you cannot trust, and that she found she no longer knew where to draw a line against a species that had already crossed every line to bring her children food. So they drew fewer lines. The seam, contested for 40 years, became a shared frontier, jointly kept, its way stations run by both peoples together, so that no one would ever again mistake a supply line for empty infrastructure. Because now the humans who ran it had knelt on last water and would never forget what a way station was for. There was a moment in the writing of the piece that Ila kept for herself and told no one about for many years. On the 2nd month, when the terms were still raw and both sides still flinched at the sight of each other across the table, a Viharan elder who had lost 3 children to the war rose to speak against the whole of it. He did not trust the food, he said. He did not trust the open doors or the vented weapons or the human who had knelt on the frost. A trap could be patient, he said. A trap could wait a generation. His grief had earned him the right to say it, and no one in the chamber, human or Viharan, moved to silence him, because a people who silences its grief has learned nothing at all. Ila let him finish, then she did not argue. She had learned better than to argue with grief, which no argument has ever moved. Instead, she asked him, quietly, through the translator, to tell her the names of his 3 children. And he did, the 3 chords of sound that no human throat could shape, and she listened to all of them, and she did not hurry. And when he was finished, she asked him to say them again so that she could learn to hold them, and he said them again. And the chamber was very quiet, and it took a long time, and no one counted the minutes. And when at last she had them, as near as a human voice could come to them, she thanked him, and she said only that she was sorry, and that she would carry the names, and that a piece built on the frost of last water would have room in it for his grief for as long as he lived, because a piece with no room for grief was only arithmetic wearing a kinder coat, and they had all had enough of arithmetic. The elder looked at her for a long moment with his wide, unblinking eyes. Then he sat down, and he did not speak against the piece again, and years later, when he died, his family sent word across 2 systems to a human envoy that the last thing he had asked was whether she still remembered the names. She did. She has never forgotten them. She never will. Corin signed the human side. He asked for that, and Os granted it, and Ila did not object, because she had come to understand that a man who has done great damage and then spent the last usefulness of his rank to help undo it has earned the right to put his name on the mending. He resigned afterward. His last act as senior envoy was to file a report to the War Council, recommending that assistant envoys be given the standing to be heard, and that no negotiation ever again proceed without someone in the room who had done the reading. He named Ila in it. He wrote that the peace had been made by a young woman he had filed under noise, and that the greatest service of his 4-treaty career had been getting out of her way, and that he hoped the council would learn from his failure the thing he had learned too late, which was that the dead are not honored by arithmetic, and that a people who cannot spare an afternoon for grief will one day find they have lost a century. Ila Ren did not become famous in the human way all at once with her face on every feed. She became something slower and, she thought, better. Among the Viharan, her name entered the language. Children on the frontier worlds learned it before they learned to count. Among humans, the story spread the way true stories spread, quietly, ship to ship, told by the crews who had been on the convoy and had knelt on the frost, until it reached the far corners of human space and settled there as the thing people meant when they said that the aliens once walked out of peace talks, and humanity's answer became a legend across the stars. They always expected, the ones who heard the beginning of it, that the answer had been a weapon. That was how such stories usually went. The enemy insults you, the enemy walks out, and the strong reply with fire, and the fire becomes the legend. And every time, the telling turned, and the turn was the whole point of it, because the answer had not been a weapon at all. The answer had been 9 unarmed ships and an open door, and a young woman kneeling on the frost of a cold world, feeding the children of the people who had walked out, and asking for nothing, and refusing to spend a single word she could not back with a deed. Years later, an interviewer asked Ila Ren, by then no longer young, though never the older man the archives sometimes lazily assumed the hero of such a tale must have been, what she had felt in the moment the Viharan walked out of the chamber. Whether she had felt the urge that the strategists had felt, the pull toward the strike, the window, the enemy off balance. She thought about it for a while, in the Viharan way, spending no words until she had one worth spending. "No," she said at last, "I felt a door closing. And I have never in my life been able to watch a door close on people who are about to die on the other side of it. So I did the only thing I have ever really known how to do. I held it open. That was all. Everyone kept waiting for it to be more than that, for it to be some grand, clever thing. It was never more than that. We held the door open when it would have been free to let it shut, and we kept it open with our own hands alone when no one made us. That is the whole legend. It is a very small thing to be a legend. But the small things are the only ones the tired ever believe. And on last water, where the seas are still locked in gray ice, and the habitable band is still a thin, bright ribbon at the equator, the Viharan Keep, to this day. A single, unremarkable object at the center of the great receiving field where the food first came down. It is a human emergency sidearm, one of 11, recovered from the dark of the seam where a young envoy vented them rather than spend a word in her own defense. They did not keep it as a trophy of a weapon defeated. They kept it as the truth made plain, the moment carelessness met honesty and honesty did not flinch. Children are brought to see it. They press their small hands flat against the frozen ground beside it, palms down, and they are told the oldest lesson their people have, the one a human taught back to them across a table where another human had forgotten it. Words are cheap. Watch what a person does when the doing is ruin. And then they are told about the door, and the ones who held it open, and the afternoon that was almost too small to spare, and how it turned out to be large enough in the end to hold a peace that has never since been broken.